Every sign refers to another sign and only to another sign ad infinitum. Today, we talk about despots. Hello everyone, welcome to Flickr Theory Reviews. I'm your host, Tadas Vinokur. Today, we explore yet another chapter of A Thousand Plateaus, which is called On Several Regimes of Signs. This chapter can be linked to two other chapters that I already reviewed, the Faciality chapter and the Postulates of Linguistics chapter. Also, to some extent, the Geology of Morals chapter. All of these chapters explore the ways in which human beings construct symbolic systems. These chapters examine how do people communicate through signs. However, as I pointed out in Geology of Morals review, the symbolic regimes don't function on their own transcendentally. They're not Platonic ideals that just hang in the air. Signs for Deleuze-Guattari function by virtue of the abstract machine called double articulation. In this so-called machine, a sign is made of both content and expression, both of which possess their own form and substance. Manuel de Landa gives an interesting explanation of double articulation. De Landa writes, "The first articulation concerns the materiality of a stratum, the selection of raw materials out of which it will be synthesized, as well as the process of giving populations of these selected materials some statistical ordering. The second articulation concerns the expressivity of a stratum." In other words, every sign is going to be to some degree affected by the materiality of content. Our understanding of the word table is going to be affected by the form and substance of that actual object, the table. Also, the same actual object, or at least our understanding of it, will be affected by the sign, the symbol, transcendental token, the signifier, table. All of this simply means that you cannot talk about one material without talking about the other, expression. They're both related. So how does all of it relate to the On Several Regimes of Signs chapter? For starters, Deleuze-Guattari examined in this chapter the regimes of signs, the constructions of cultural expression, without emphasizing the materiality, objectiveness of these symbolic formations. Basically, Deleuze-Guattari want to explore how does our cultural vocabulary, archetypes, personality types, social lifestyles function on their own. They are interested in the pragmatics of symbolic regimes. That is, how do we actually use these transcendent things called symbols? One could say that Deleuze-Guattari are being deliberately opportunistic here. They only want to discuss the expression of meaning without discussing the material content of meaning. Well, what is a regime of signs? As I noted, the regime of signs is articulated or expressed linguistically. It is a specific kind of expression formation that is taken in its own right. Deleuze-Guattari write, "We call any specific formalization of expression a regime of signs, at least when the expression is linguistic. A regime of signs constitutes a semiotic system." It's a semiotic system. In this chapter, Deleuze-Guattari examined four regimes of signs: pre-signifying, the signifying, the counter-signifying, and the post-signifying. The most important of these four are the signifying and post-signifying regimes. Deleuze-Guattari spent most of this chapter discussing these two regimes of signs. The counter-signifying and the pre-signifying regimes can be understood as subsidiary regimes that relate antagonistically to the signifying and post-signifying regimes. Let us start with signifying regime of signs then. This is a regime that is directed towards stasis, or the construction of stable meaning. For this reason, Deleuze-Guattari claim that the signifying regime of signs is related to despotism. If the construction of stable meaning becomes the ultimate goal of expression, then there has to be a center, a despotic center, if you will, around which such a regime of signs can be organized. In other words, expression of meaning in the signifying regime is spread through representatives of the regime, bureaucratic systems. Deleuze-Guattari write, "The signifying regime is not simply faced with the task of organizing into circles signs emitted from every direction. It must constantly assure the expansion of the circles or spiral. It must provide the center with more signifier to overcome the entropy inherent in the system and to make new circles blossom or replenish the old. The idea of entropy is crucial here. The despotic regime of science is paranoid in its goal to establish unity or stasis. The distribution of signs is always unstable. Every sign relates to another sign. Every sign generates linkages, chains with other signs. Therefore, stability of meaning is always deterritorialized, undermined. Therefore, what we need is a center. The center is constructed around which the words of the king or the despot are disseminated through concentric circles. I said that the signifying regime is paranoid for a reason. When the despotic regime grows, even the most devout adherents of the despot have to worry. Because as you go further from the center, it becomes less and less clear what the despot wants precisely. What does he want exactly? For Deleuze and Guattari, the signifying regime of science does not just refer to an imperial political construction, that of despotism. It refers also to all power groups that are arborescent, hierarchical, oppressive, groups that subject and control people from the center. These are the groups that possess a dominant face at the center. Remember Faciality chapter, who represents the organized unit. As Deleuze and Guattari write, these groups can include political parties, literary movements, psychoanalytic associations, families, conjugal units, etc. Deleuze and Guattari also add, the signifier reigns over every domestic squabble and in every state apparatus, meaning that the hierarchical constructions of meaning are everywhere. They undermine the inventive capacities of their subjects and, more importantly, they scapegoat everyone who is able to generate a line of flight, an act of fleeing, eluding the hierarchical system. Now let's discuss the second most important regime of science, the post-signifying regime. Deleuze and Guattari contrast the paranoid interpretive despotic regime that we just discussed with the passional post-signifying subjective regime. It's called passional because people within the post-signifying regime passionately recover their subjectivity as the despot turns away from his people. In other words, the post-signifying regime defines a situation wherein the despotic regime stops emanating clear-cut orders and turns away from the people. When a despot creates strict orders and specific subjectivities, as he does in the signifying regime, he also creates an opening for certain subjective deviances, lines of flight, which ultimately create new distinct subjects. One could say that within the post-signifying regime, the line of flight attains a positive value. Deterritorialization itself becomes a goal for these subjects that are emerging. Deleuze and Guattari write, what happens in the second regime by comparison with the signifying regime as we have already defined it? In the first place, a sign or a packet of signs detaches from the irradiating circular network and sets to work on its own account, starts running a straight line as though swept into a narrow, open passage. Already the signifying system drew a line of flight or deterritorialization exceeding the specific index of its deterritorialized signs. But the system gave that line a negative value and sent the scapegoat fleeing down it. Here it seems that the line receives a positive sign, as though it were effectively occupied and followed by a people who find in it the reason for being or destiny. That's the post-signifying regime. With this in mind, one could make an argument that the post-signifying regime enables subjects, allows them to harness their lines of flight. However, the post-signifying regime still keeps the bureaucratic system of control in place. This means that control of the meaning becomes associated with people's consent to participate in such control. Here, Deleuze and Guattari claim that a new form of slavery is invented, namely being slave to oneself. Post-signifying regime has a lot to do with a loss of despotic power or clear sovereignty, something that Carl Schmitt also discussed in Political Theology. Post-signifying regime describes the birth of governance by virtue of the public's consent. It is a passional consent that results from global insistence on deterritorialization as a form of subject formation. The problem with the post-signifying regime is that it only readjusts the signifying regime. It does not totally obliterate it. The signifying regime provides meanings that can be subverted by a post-signifying regime. However, the post-signifying regime nonetheless coagulates, stratifies, or segments the line of flight. As I discussed in the review of the faciality chapter, post-signifying regime generates black holes which absorb all imperatives by the despot and segments or creates distinct subjects. Post-signifying regime then is not precisely a way to totally escape the despotic regime. Deleuze and Guattari, when referring to post-signifying regime, write, "Thus, subjectification imposes on the line of flight a segmentarity that is forever repudiating that line, and upon absolute deterritorialization, a point of abolition that is forever blocking that deterritorialization or diverting it. The reason for this is simple. Forms of expression and regimes of signs are still strata. Subjectification is no less a stratum than signifiance." In other words, while functioning, reasoning, and working within the strata of subjectification and signifiance, or in general within signifying and post-signifying regimes of signs, we will never access the plane of consistency where there is no longer any regime of signs to be found. We will never fully harness the immanent potential of the line of light. Finally, let's just quickly mention two other regimes of signs that Deleuze and Guattari briefly discuss in this chapter: the pre-signifying regime of signs and the counter-signifying regime of signs. The pre-signifying regime of signs, as Deleuze and Guattari describe it, is plurilinear segmentary, multidimensional semiotic that wards off any kind of signifying circularity. This regime of signs protects the symbolic and political field from hierarchical state form, from universalizing abstraction, erection of signifier, and circularity of statements. The regime fights the hierarchies in their embryonic state. The counter-signifying regime of signs fights and abolishes the hierarchical state form or despotic signifying regime. This is the regime that employs nomadism, or an abstract machine of mutation, or what Deleuze and Guattari call the war machine. This is the regime that generates smooth space within the signifying regime, where the composition of hierarchical social relations is eroded, totally eroded. In this chapter, Deleuze and Guattari wants us to question even the most liberating forms of subjectification. They show us that it is actually really hard to invent something new, a nomad. Well, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.